Alright everyone, today we're going to be talking about American democracy, and the question of whether the US can be considered a democracy. In 2014, a study made headlines across much of American media. Researchers Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page appeared to have made a startling discovery. Gilens and Page looked at 1,779 policy issues to discern the influence of average citizens, economic elites, and organized interest groups on the likelihood of a policy being enacted. They reported that economic elites and business-oriented interest groups exerted powerful influence, while average citizens and other kinds of interest groups exerted very little influence. Multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. What do our findings say about democracy in America? They certainly constituted troubling news for advocates of populistic democracy, who want governments to respond primarily or exclusively to the policy preferences of their citizens. In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites or with organized interests, they generally lose. However, there was quickly a pushback to Gilens and Page, with other researchers presenting rebuttals. An article appeared in Vox in May 2016 summarizing these rebuttals. Critics attacked the methodology of Gilens and Page, and Gilens and Page followed up with a response to these rebuttals. So who in this controversy was right? Is the US a democracy or an oligarchy? This video is going to have 3 parts. First, I want to tackle the academic controversy over the research of Gilens and Page. Next, I want to explore more thoroughly what democracy even is, and how ancient thinkers originally defined democracy, which I think will help make sense of the findings of Gilens and Page. Finally, I want to answer the question of, fundamentally, how sociopolitical power is structured in the US. Who rules America? If America isn't a democracy, then what exactly is it? So let's delve in. In their paper, Gilens and Page examined the influence of median-income Americans versus affluent Americans on the likelihood that policy proposals will be enacted. Median income Americans are defined as having a household income at the 50th percentile, and affluent Americans are defined as having a household income at the 90th percentile. Gilens and Page also tested the influence of 2 kinds of interest groups: mass-based interest groups and business-oriented interest groups. The former consists of interest groups advocating for social causes like labor rights, abortion rights, environmentalism, etc. And the latter, I think, are self-explanatory. They're interest groups advocating pro-business policies, such as cutting corporate tax rates, deregulation, etc. Gilens and Page performed a multivariate analysis on the independent influence of each group in regard to 1,779 policy issues, and this was their ultimate result. As can be seen, the results are rather grim for the notion that the United States is a democracy. The single most influential group was the economic elites, at a 0.78 correlation with policy outcomes. The second most influential group was business-oriented interest groups, at 0.43. Then mass-based interest groups at 0.24, and then the preferences of average citizens at a dismal 0.05. However, as I said, Gilens and Page soon received criticism from other researchers. There are 2 main thrusts to this criticism. 1. Gilens and Page are actually wrong, and when reanalyzing the data, affluent and median-income Americans actually have a roughly equal influence. And 2, the policy preferences of affluent and median-income Americans aren't that distinct anyways. Gilens and Page responded to these criticisms in a follow-up in the Washington Post. In regard to the first point, this argument was put forth by researchers who reanalyzed the raw data of Gilens and Page using a different approach. They calculated the win rates of affluent and median income Americans, and found that median income Americans won quote-unquote 47% of the time, and affluent Americans won 53% of the time. This seems to be a very small and inconsequential gap. However, as Gilens and Page point out, win rates don't necessarily measure influence on policy, even though that might not be intuitive. The reason is because there are many policy issues where there isn't a sharp division between affluent and median income Americans, and this creates a misleading result. To quote Gilens and Page, these critics treat a slim majority, say 51%, as equivalent to an overwhelming majority, say 91%. If we stop using the majority plus one approach of 50% support as the dividing line and replace it with a more politically consequential benchmark of strong support, 75% or above, the differences between middle class and high income respondents is much larger. When only the affluent strongly support a proposed policy change, that policy is adopted 46% of the time. When only the middle class strongly support a policy, that policy is adopted only 24% of the time. When a policy is strongly opposed by the affluent, less than 25% support, but not strongly opposed by the middle class, that policy is adopted only 4% of the time. But when a policy is strongly opposed by the middle class, but not by the affluent, the policy is adopted 40% of the time. So essentially, when affluent and median income Americans diverge more significantly on a policy, a much larger gap in win rates is observed. This also partially addresses the second argument, that the policy preferences of affluent and median income Americans aren't that distinct. Gilens and Page point out that there are indeed many issues where affluent and median income Americans seem to agree. They calculate that the correlation between the policy preferences of affluent and median income Americans is 0.78. So on most of the issues in their database, there was no significant difference between the 50th and 90th percentiles. However, on issues where there were significant differences, which predictably include many economic issues, Americans at the 90th percentile clearly exert much more influence. And there's another point to be made, which Gilens and Page also touch on. Gilens and Page define affluent Americans as those whose household income is at the 90th percentile. But as Gilens and Page concede themselves, it's a stretch to say that those in the 90th percentile are truly wealthy. Today, American households at the 90th percentile make roughly $216,000 a year. Though bear in mind that this is household income, not individual income. A married couple, each making $108,000 a year, would have a household income of $216,000. This couple is certainly well off, but Americans generally wouldn't consider them wealthy. This is more the range of the educated upper middle class than the wealthy. So, measuring the policy preferences of Americans at the 50th percentile versus the 90th percentile might be understating the political differences between working class Americans and truly wealthy Americans. Whatever differences exist between Americans at the 50th percentile versus the 90th percentile, the differences between, say, Americans at the 50th percentile versus the 99th percentile might be far larger. And Gilens and Page acknowledge this. However, they cite a lack of data on the preferences of the truly wealthy as to why they went with the 90th percentile to define the affluent. But they do cite data which suggests that the political gap between average Americans and the truly wealthy is indeed far larger. For instance, consider a study of Chicago area millionaires conducted in 2011. Across a range of economic policies, the broader public was far more likely to support government efforts to improve the lives of ordinary citizens than were the millionaires. For example, 68% of the public, but only 19% of the millionaires, thought the government ought to see to it that everyone who wants to work can find a job. Fully 78% of the public and only 40% of the millionaires thought that the minimum wage should be high enough so that no family with a full-time worker falls below the poverty line. And 58% of the millionaires, but only 27% of the public, thought that to reduce the federal budget deficit, the US should cut spending on domestic programs like Medicare, education, and highways. It would be reasonable to think that these truly rich Americans exert more influence over policy than the merely affluent. Since Gilens and Page only focus on the 50th percentile versus the 90th percentile, the disparity in influence they uncovered, as egregious as it is, likely still dramatically underestimates how little influence average Americans have over policy compared to the wealthy. When factoring this in, it's a pretty safe bet that average Americans have functionally no influence on policy. And these results make sense. It's not difficult to find examples in recent American history of wide gaps between public policy preferences and actual policy. Let's take a somewhat notorious example, the minimum wage. Biden campaigned in 2020 on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, a policy supported by 62% of Americans, according to an April 2021 Pew Research poll. Today, as of recording this, in August 2024, the federal minimum wage, it turns out, is not $15 and is still $7 an hour. So why is this the case? Well, in 2021, the parliamentarian ruled that the $15 minimum wage couldn't go through the Senate. Now you might be asking, what the hell is the parliamentarian? That's a reasonable question to ask, because the parliamentarian is an obscure advisor in the Senate who issues rulings on senatorial procedure. Their rulings are non-binding and can be overruled by the presiding officer in the Senate, which is the vice president. But Kamala Harris didn't do that, and a subsequent vote on the issue, initiated by Bernie Sanders, failed. This is something supported by 62% of Americans, and yet it just doesn't happen. Something I didn't mention is that the plan wasn't even to raise the minimum wage to $15 immediately, but rather to gradually raise it until 2025, by which time it obviously would have depreciated significantly, even without the obscene post-COVID inflation. But even something this small and simple and popular couldn't get through in a supposed democracy. Another example is higher taxes on the rich. The surveys consistently show overwhelming support for raising taxes on the rich. A 2022 survey by Navigator Research showed a crushing 79% support for raising taxes on the rich. A 2019 survey by The Hill and HarrisX found that 59% of Americans specifically supported raising the top marginal tax rate to 70%. Currently, it is 37%, and there is no congressional effort at all to raise it. At best, the Democrats might let some Republican tax cuts on the rich expire, which they did in 2013, allowing the top marginal rate to rise from 35% to 39.6%. Gee, whoa. Trump lowered the top marginal rate to 37%, which is where it remains today. Again, 59% popular support, and it's not even on the agenda. Another example is a federal jobs guarantee. There have been 9 polls on this issue since 2018, and on average, support was at 59%. For example, the Center for Working Class Politics and Jacobin surveyed Americans on whether they'd support a federal guarantee of a job which pays a living wage. And these two surveys found 62% and 60% support. But again, it's not even on the agenda. In fact, Kamala Harris, who previously pretended to support a federal jobs guarantee, has backed away from it now that she's running for president. This would be a bizarre thing to do in a democracy, given how popular this policy is, but it makes sense if the US is actually an oligarchy where the rich rule. Kamala's wealthy donors might not like it if she were to push a policy that would eliminate the reserve army of labor and thus dramatically increase the bargaining power of workers. So it's pretty obvious that the US is not a democracy, just as Gilens and Page documented. So the question then arises, how could the US not be a democracy? After all, the US seems to have all the characteristics of a democracy. The US has competitive elections with universal suffrage. The supreme legislative body, the Congress, is selected by citizens through competitive elections. The head of state, the president, is also selected by the citizens through competitive elections, though slightly indirectly with the Electoral College. At the state and local levels, city councils are elected, mayors are elected, governors are elected, and state legislators are elected, all through direct popular vote with universal suffrage. And the judicial branch and the heads of government agencies are appointed by the elected politicians. So it seems like the USA is not only democratic, but hyper-democratic. What exactly is going on? How can American policy be so unrepresentative of the popular will? Well, to sift through this conundrum, I think we ought to turn to the ancient conception of democracy as espoused by Plato and Aristotle. The word democracy comes from ancient Greece, but the definition has changed considerably over time. When Plato and Aristotle wrote about democracy, they meant something rather different, and I think their writings, despite being 2,000 years old, can actually shed quite a bit of light on how it is the US can have all these institutional characteristics, yet still be completely unresponsive to the desires of ordinary citizens. First, let's turn to Plato and see what he had to say about democracy in the Republic, which he wrote in the early 4th century BC. Toward the middle of the Republic, Plato analyzes the different kinds of political regimes he observed in his part of the world. He details a taxonomy of political regimes, of which he says there are 5. Aristocracy or monarchy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Plato believed that societies tended to move through these regimes, that one regime would tend to give rise to the next. As such, I think it's necessary to explain Plato's taxonomy of political regimes thoroughly, because to understand what he means by democracy, you have to understand how democracy fits into the context of this whole scheme. To begin, aristocracy or monarchy is the first stage. In this regime, political power is vested in an enlightened, wise elite. At the head of state might be a wise philosopher king, or an aristocracy, which Plato calls guardians and auxiliaries. For Plato, this was the best and most ideal form of government. Plato was deeply elitist and believed that humans were naturally unequal in their abilities and fitness to rule. He believed that different social stratas were literally different breeds of human who should never intermix. However, even though Plato was profoundly elitist, he believed that aristocrats needed to govern with the collective interest in mind. Aristocrats are virtuous rather than exploitative. Plato explicitly recommends that aristocrats be kept modest in wealth because he believed that wealth corrupted aristocrats and turned them selfish and exploitative. Plato then turns to how aristocracy degenerates into timocracy. Timocracy is a halfway between aristocracy and oligarchy, so let's just skip straight to oligarchy. In an oligarchy, society is no longer governed by a wise aristocracy, but rather by the rich. Economic inequality explodes, and the rich become the ruling class. Plato believed that this was a problem because the rich were incapable of governing in the collective interest, or rather, they only govern in their own interest. And what manner of government do you term oligarchy? A government resting on a valuation of property, in which the rich have power and the poor man is deprived of it. One seeing another grow rich seeks to rival him, and thus the great mass of the citizens become lovers of money. The more they think of making a fortune, the less they think of virtue. For when riches and virtue are placed together in the scales of the balance, the one always rises as the other falls. And in proportion as riches and rich men are honored in the state, virtue and the virtuous are dishonored. For oligarchies have both the extremes of great wealth and utter poverty. Following this, Plato explains how oligarchy descends into democracy. And this is where we can see how the ancient conception of democracy diverges considerably from the modern conception. And next comes democracy and the democratic man, out of oligarchy and the oligarchical man. Insatiable avarice is the ruling passion of an oligarchy. Thus, men of family often lose their property or rights of citizenship, but they remain in the city, full of hatred against the new owners of their estates, and ripe for revolution. The ruling class do not want remedies. They care only for money, and are as careless of virtue as the poorest of citizens. And democracy comes into power when the poor are the victors, killing some and exiling some, and giving equal shares in the government to all the rest. Equality and fraternity of governors and governed is the approved principle. A father and son, a citizen and a foreigner, teacher and pupil, old and young, are all on a level. Slaves are on a level with their masters and mistresses, and there is no difference between men and women. Nay, the very animals in a democratic state have a freedom which is unknown in other places. The she-dogs are as good as their she-mistresses. Now, you have to keep in mind Plato's class bias. Plato was very much not a fan of democracy, and is obviously disparaging democracy here. He is definitely exaggerating for effect, and probably not being completely literal. But the basic gist, I think, is clear. For Plato, democracy is essentially a society in a revolutionary upheaval. It's the natural consequence of oligarchy. As the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, the poor eventually have enough and revolt. This makes sense especially when you understand where the word democracy comes from. In ancient Greek, the word demos meant the common people, essentially the lower classes. Democracy meant the rule of the common people, of the poor. Democracy, in Plato's framework, is a situation of a political tumult, where the elites are besieged by the common people. Another ancient Greek term for this is ochlocracy, which refers to a society gripped by mob rule, where common people intimidate state authorities and the elites, and make demands for economic and political reform. The final stage of Plato's taxonomy is tyranny. For Plato, a tyranny always emerged from democracy because the common people inevitably turn to a leader who will champion their interests. When the people meet, they are omnipotent, but they cannot be brought together unless they are attracted by a little honey, and the rich are made to supply the honey. Their victims attempt to resist. They are driven mad by the stings of the drones, and so become downright oligarchs in self-defense. Then follow informations and convictions for treason. The people have some protector whom they nurse into greatness, and from this root the tree of tyranny springs. So the protector, who tastes human blood, and slays some and exiles others, with or without law, who hints at abolition of debts and division of lands, must either perish or become a wolf, that is, a tyrant. So Plato says that the poor inevitably vest power into a populist or revolutionary dictator who purges the old elites and implements economic reforms. And those are Plato's regimes: aristocracy degenerating into oligarchy, which provokes popular revolt, leading to democracy and then tyranny. Now let's turn to Aristotle and see what he had to say about democracy in the Politics, a few decades after Plato wrote the Republic. Aristotle defines democracy in a different but related way as Plato. If then a government of many, and all of them good men, compose an aristocracy, when many persons equal in virtue appeared at the time, they brooked not a superiority, but sought after an equality, and established a free state. But after this, when they degenerated, they made a property of the public, which probably gave rise to oligarchies, for they made wealth meritorious, and the honors of government were reserved for the rich, and these afterwards turned to tyrannies, and these in their turn gave rise to democracies. Here, Aristotle is referring again to the progression of regimes which Plato laid out, but it's slightly modified. He's using the concept of democracy somewhat differently. Aristotle is referring to democracy as a regime which comes after tyranny. And how does Aristotle define democracy? An oligarchy considers only the rich, and a democracy only the poor. An oligarchy, where the supreme power of the state is lodged with the rich. A democracy, on the contrary, is where those who have it are worth little or nothing. We ought not to define a democracy as some do, who say simply that it is a government where the supreme power is lodged in the people. For let us suppose the number of a people to be 1,300, and that of these 1,000 were rich, who would not permit the 300 poor to have any share in the government, although they were free, and they're equal in everything else. No one would say that this government was a democracy. In like manner, if the poor, when few in number, should acquire the power over the rich, though more than themselves, no one would say that this was an oligarchy. So, to Aristotle, democracy is the rule of the poor. But unlike Plato, Aristotle is defining democracy as a more concrete and stable political system. So what does this system look like? Among these, two ways of appointment are democratic: for all to appoint from all, by vote or by lot or by both, and for some to appoint from all, to some offices by vote and to others by lot or by both, is oligarchical. For Aristotle, democracy is a form of direct rule by the poor. Tyrannies, if they survived long enough, eventually evolved into democracies, with political power devolving to the poor. The poor began directly governing. Aristotle says that in democracies, political officials were appointed by all citizens from all citizens, either by elections or by lot, aka sortition, where citizens were randomly chosen. Essentially, in democracies, all citizens had a roughly equal chance of holding political office. Political officials were broadly representative of the population demographically. Aristotle spells this out even more clearly elsewhere in the Politics. In the third place is a combination of the two systems, taking some features from the oligarchical law and some from the democratic. I mean, for example, that it is thought to be democratic for the offices to be assigned by lot, for them to be elected oligarchic. Aristotle says that sortition was thought to be much more democratic than election. Sortition guarantees that the poor comprise the majority of political officials, and this was the fundamental characteristic of a democratic system. By contrast, in an oligarchy, the rich chose who held political office. Aristotle even clarifies that even if the poor and rich are theoretically politically equal, if in practice the rich actually dominate the political system, then a society isn't a democracy. The ancient Greek conception of democracy informs the model of direct democracy advocated by Paul Cockshott and Alan Cottrell in Towards a New Socialism. They advocate for sortition, for politicians to be randomly selected from the population to ensure a working class majority. And it should also be noted that this understanding of democracy was prevalent among educated people in the West until really the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the founding fathers of the US spoke derisively about democracy. They were influenced by this understanding of democracy as the rule of the poor. When Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1847 about winning the battle for democracy, they really meant a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the working class would hold supreme political power. By the 20th century, the popular understanding of democracy had shifted to the current conception, where democracy is defined more by superficial institutional characteristics. Elections represent the will of the people, quote-unquote, even if elected politicians aren't actually demographically representative of the general population. This understanding of democracy is obviously nonsense. The ancient conception of democracy can make sense of the findings of Gilens and Page. The United States in the 2020s would quite clearly be recognized by Plato and Aristotle as an oligarchy, rather than a democracy. On an institutional level, what Aristotle describes as oligarchy is somewhat different from how the US political system works, but it's still similar. The rich hold ultimate political power in the US, even though the rich and poor are nominally politically equal. But how exactly does this work at an institutional level? How do American elections produce an oligarchy? Well, let's remember how Aristotle described democracies in his day. He observed that in democracies, all the citizens had a roughly equal chance of holding political office, which necessarily ensured that the poor ruled. So, in America today, do all citizens have a roughly equal chance of holding political office? No. That's pretty obvious to most people, I think. And let's go through exactly why that is. Let's say you want to run for political office in America. That's a pretty major undertaking. To run a competitive campaign, you need to hire staffers to run your operations. You need to run advertisements on TV and the internet to build a name recognition and notify people that you even exist. And you need the free time to campaign for office. A working class person getting by with a retail job or packing meat isn't going to have the money and time to run a competitive campaign. In fact, even upper middle class people will have difficulty running a competitive campaign. Even a campaign at the local or state level might cost tens of thousands of dollars to be competitive. And when you get to the federal level, it can quickly get out of control into the millions and even tens of millions. This is why in America, there are basically only two pathways to political office, with very rare exception. You can either be a rich person yourself and fund your own campaign, or you can solicit donations from rich people, with the obvious expectation that once you get into office, you won't do anything to offend your wealthy donors. Who will rich people choose to fund? A working class candidate pushing for higher taxes on the rich, or a posh Ivy League educated careerist who will do whatever their donors tell them to. The ultimate result is that American politicians are utterly beholden to wealthy interests, which leads to ordinary working class citizens having virtually zero influence on policy. It makes sense why Aristotle believed that sortition was a much more democratic way of selecting political officials than elections. The rich have an overwhelming advantage in elections. Recently, I read The Squad by Ryan Grimm, and at one point, Grimm describes in some detail how congresspeople spend their days, and how most of their daily work is quite literally just fundraising and socializing with wealthy donors. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee used the orientation process to hammer home to its members the importance of immediately beginning to fundraise for the next election. The DCCC had put together a PowerPoint presentation for freshmen. The daily schedule they recommend contemplates a 9 or 10-hour day while members are in Washington. Of that, 4 hours are to be spent in call time, and another hour is blocked off for strategic outreach, which includes fundraisers and press work. An hour is walled off to recharge, and 3 to 4 hours are designated for the actual work of being a member of Congress, hearings, votes, and meetings with constituents. If the constituents are donors, all the better. Congressional hearings and fundraising duties often conflict, and members of Congress have little difficulty deciding between the two. It is considered poor form in Congress, borderline self-indulgent, for a freshman to sit at length in congressional hearings when the time could instead be spent raising money. That's the glorious democracy of the USA. The Democrats and Republicans are less real political parties and more like professional associations for political careerists, representing different wings of the American bourgeoisie, taking their orders from wealthy donors or just being extremely wealthy oligarchs themselves. And bear in mind that the elected politicians appoint the judges and the heads of government agencies, meaning the entire state apparatus is effectively subservient to the oligarchy. For America to truly become a democracy, common working class people need to hold real political power. We need to win the battle for democracy. So long as the system remains as it is, there will be no major positive change for the working class. No, not even voting for Democrats is going to bring that change. Alright, see you next time.